Thank you very much for that charming introduction and for the opportunity to be here. I should point out, you run through my long career, and someone once introduced me and they said, so Richard, you must know all the answers, and which of course isn't true. And in fact, my typical response is that, I've simply had the opportunity to make more mistakes than anyone else, and hopefully learn from them along the way. And also by background, as you point out, I did start my digital media career in 1980. I actually started working with media technology before that. I came out of college as a filmmaker. I didn't study computer science. Computers in 1973 were punch cards, so it wasn't as compelling to me then as it might be today. But I ended up going to work for the Public Broadcasting Service in Washington, D.C., and ended up working for the CEO and chairman of PBS at that time, Hartford Gunn, who was an extraordinary visionary when it came to media. And I worked with him on several technology-related projects, including the installation of the first satellite network in the United States, along with HBO. Initial efforts in broadcast teletext, which were really the first interactive information products in the 1979-1980 period. But he said something to me once which really has strongly influenced my career. He said, Richard, if you're interested in the evolution of media, then it's really all about the technology, because it's the technology that sets the playing field, establishes the ground rules for how media evolves. And that might sound obvious today, because I think it's very, very clear of the impact of technology on media and indeed society. It was probably a little bit less obvious then. And when I say technology and its impact on media, that doesn't mean it's all necessarily good. As I often point out, technology has value, but it doesn't have values, right? It's obviously up to us and what we do with it. And I think that's certainly proving to be the case in our world today. And I'll talk some about that. So let's go into that. So I didn't feel tonight for this group that I didn't want to go through a formal speech. But what I did think I would do is start with, 15, 20 minutes of a ramble. Sometimes it goes longer than I expect. Just ramble around the subject matter here from a number of different dimensions, and then allow us to have a conversation about it. Trust media and the evolution of democracy. And in fact, I recently was asked to join the Knight Commission, which is of that name, Trust Media and the Future of Democracy. And I think that is one of the more significant questions facing us today, if not the most significant question facing us today. So let me start that ramble. One thing that's clear is we obviously live in an extraordinarily different world, an extraordinarily different media world. And to no small degree, that did indeed start with the introduction of the internet and the World Wide Web 25 or so years ago. And it's been an extraordinary thing, right? I don't think anyone would think for a second, maybe some people today would think for a second that we should roll back the internet, but I certainly wouldn't, right? It's been an extraordinary resource for billions, literally billions of people, providing them with access to information and knowledge that they never had before. Whether that be medical information in parts of the world where they had none, or farmers in parts of the world having access to market information to help prevent them from getting too taken advantage of by middlemen. There are just all kinds of powerful and extraordinary benefits that the internet has brought to us. But the truth is, when you think of it from a standpoint of free expression, the internet is indeed the embodiment of free expression. In this country, you can think of it as the First Amendment come to life. It's given everyone the opportunity to express themselves to everyone else. Now, that doesn't mean everyone has to listen to them, of course, but they do have that opportunity. And that's an extraordinary thing. And I think most of us intrinsically would say that's an amazing and a wonderful thing. But of course, when one believes in free expression, part of that belief is in accepting the fact that there will be expression out there that each one of us, in our own way, finds deeply uncomfortable. Right? It's not all good, and clearly we see significant indications of that today. So as a result, obviously, the internet, the web, and free expression challenges us. It challenges our institutions, who were comfortable from a prior era when they didn't have to confront all this free expression there. It's challenged our governments, and it's challenged our media institutions as well, in significant ways. So I think it's important for us to recognize that, and recognize it for what it is. Interestingly, I think one of the things that challenges us today is a sense of divisiveness, and it is true. We live in a particularly divisive society, but that too, you could easily, track that back to the breadth of free expression. In fact, to me, there's if you want to think about technologies of media distribution. As access to media distribution expands, it intrinsically becomes more divisive. It's actually a simple mathematical principle. And I'm not talking about divisive in the political sense, though that comes along with it. But literally from the perspective of, if you want to unify a society, then you have single state-run media, right? Right now, one of the more unified societies in the world is North Korea. Right? You're told what to know, what to think, and you actually can get comfortable with it. I was speaking to some friends who were in North Korea recently from the New York Times, and that was one of their takeaways. Is like, it's not like you encounter people there who aren't happy. Obviously, there are vast numbers of people in North Korea who may be starving, but the ones you're exposed to are comfortable with where they are in their society, because their basis of information is what they're fed. We in the United States in the 60s and 70s, you had dominant print media, you had dominant television networks, 3 television networks. We had Uncle Walter Cronkite, who could be our unifying force. We moved to cable television, more voices, more channels, more divisiveness. That's when you begin to saw the expansion of the cable news networks, and their further evolution into partisan voices to some extent as well. And now we have the internet, where you've got millions of voices. And so, what would you expect is you'll get some degrees of or extraordinary degrees of divisiveness. And this is a little bit of an aside, is sometimes I think people looking at the state of the world today, and disinformation and divisiveness and so on, and they say, this internet thing, it's ruined our society. And I go, actually, it might actually be more true that what the internet has done is simply exposed us for who we are. And then amplified it and amplified it and amplified, but it's exposed us for who we are. I think that's largely true. So it's obviously created an environment that does challenge us in many ways. And clearly, in the last year, with the particular focus on fake news, or what I prefer to call disinformation, is obviously underlines that in a significant way. Now, as we know, the term itself, fake news, has been weaponized. It's basically content about me that I don't like. So yeah, the New York Times is fake. Breitbart is fake. I'm always surprised, or I should say not surprised, as I look at the kind of feedback that comes into Google products, Google News, the founder of which, Krishna Bharat, is sitting here in the front row. I see a significant amount of feedback that says, why do you have that fake news site NPR and New York Times and Washington Post inside Google News? So obviously, people have very different perspectives. But I think, a lot of the discussion about fake news has gotten wound around the influence of bad state actors. And I think that's certainly a significant part of it, though I don't think that's by any means all of it or even a majority of it. As researchers at MIT pointed out several months back, and they were studying the influence of media over the course of the 2018 election, and they were studying it quite methodically over that whole period of analyzing a very broad range of media. And their conclusion was that fake news actually wasn't the key influencer on the election. What was the key influencer on the election was partisan and hyper-partisan content, some of which came from news outlets, some of which didn't come from news outlets. Which makes it, by the way, an even more vexing problem in a sense to deal with. At Google, obviously, we've faced a fair amount of criticism of, well, why did you surface X or Y or Z in different situations? And by the way, that there are many things that we can do better, and I'll gladly talk about that as well. So I don't say this to deny the criticism. But the fact is, as I often point out, is in dealing with, quotes, fake news or disinformation, we need to recognize that, at least in this country under the First Amendment, that nearly all of it is legal. In fact, the only expression out there that it's not is these very, very narrowly defined areas of, say, hate speech. And in the United States, the definition of hate speech is, the bar is very, very high. I mean, if you're not literally commanding people to, come to the town square and bring your guns so that we can kill those bad people, then it's not hate speech. And so it's a particularly vexing problem. And I'll come back to that as well. But there is a huge issue with partisan and hyperpartisan media. Nothing particularly new in that regard. As any of us who've studied media, you can go back to the earliest days of the printing press. You can certainly go back to the earlier days of American history with the Federalist Papers and so on and so forth, and see all kinds of partisan media and slanderous media of all types and stripes. So there's nothing new historically here, except maybe its quantity and the sophistication of its distribution. But the reason we have it is it plays well, right? I mean, the truth is that affirmation is always more appealing than information. That's a very easy card for people to play. And when I look at the landscape today, I honestly look at cable news, for instance, and I say, MSNBC, Fox News, neither one of you are doing a particularly good job of helping bringing us together, because largely you're just singing to your choirs. It's troubling, but that's part of what we get with free expression. So again, we've got some significant challenges here. I think the ultimate challenge that we face, in truth, which is in a sense why the title of the talk is what it is today, is how can democracies survive and thrive in a world of unfettered free expression? Right. Sounds paradoxical, right? Because we constantly we often equate democracy and free expression together, as we should. But as paradoxical as it sounds, I think it is absolutely the right question to be asking. Because when you think about it, how do democracies work? Democracies work to the extent that you can bring people together, find consensus among divergent opinions. And that's hard, even in the best of times. But in our world today, we're confronted with the challenge of how do you bring people together with divergent factual realities? A much, much harder challenge for us to embrace. And I think to address that, we're going to have to go very deep into our own institutional sensibilities, whether that be a company like Google and our platforms of expression and our efforts with Google Search, or whether that be people in the media and journalism community. How do we basically rethink what we do? But these things aren't easy, and I would never suggest that they are. We've been 25 years into the internet, and there are still many publishers and news organizations who have not really come to grips with the degree of change that needs to happen, because the disruptions have been so deep, and change is hard. And there's also a factor that, interestingly, with technology is, those of us involved in technology, you come up with an idea for something, and you brainstorm all its wonderful benefits. And sometimes you maybe even think about the secondary consequences, but not so much. You think, this is a great tool for X, Y, or Z. But the truth is with technology, and a sociologist by the name of William Ogden pointed this out some 75 years ago, is that when it comes to technology and its impact on society, there's inevitably a cultural lag in the understanding of its impact, right? In fact, what's his name? Einstein. Einstein said this about the atom. He said, the atom has changed everything except our thinking. And indeed, our future as a species is going to depend on us evolving our thinking about how we manage the impact of the technology. So I think that is so true today. There's this cultural lag, and I say it because I think it's always important to understand the difficulties of understanding the impact of technology, its secondary consequences, its negative consequences, its unintended consequences, and fully coming to grips with not only an understanding of the impact, but then to actually come up with what are the constructs that can address those issues. So it is a particular challenge. So at Google, for instance, with regard to fake news, I know I spent a ton of time on this, and we can certainly come back to it with questions if there are any. We've obviously spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure out how do we best deal with disinformation that we might surface in Google search. And it's a challenge. For among many other things, by the way, the corpus of content on the web, we see something like 100,000 documents a second in the news, a minute, I should say, in the news sector alone. So you're talking about a tremendous flood of information. And also, when it comes to Google queries, every day, 15% of the queries that we address are queries that we've not seen before. Right? So obviously, constant evolution. I don't say that to suggest that these aren't challenges that we can't manage. The question is, how do we manage them? I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, we had the Vegas shooting. And within a few hours of the Vegas shooting, some folks on 4chan had somehow came to the conclusion that the shooter was actually not Stephen Paddock, but Stephen Paddock's wife's ex-husband, a guy named James Damore. And they found some stuff about him that somehow got them to think he was a liberal Antifa guy or whatever, and they went after him. And so in those few hours after the shooting, if you actually searched for this fellow James Damore on Google search, we came back and we actually surfaced this 4chan content about him, saying that he was indeed the shooter and he was an extreme leftist and so on and so forth. And we were criticized for that, and indeed appropriately so. But let me tell you in a sense what we got right and what we got wrong, because I say this because it kind of gets to some of the core of the challenges that we face as a search engine, by the way. Which is this. So what we got right was against that very, very narrow query of James Damore, which, by the way, was seen by roughly 3,000 people. We surfaced this 4chan result. I actually think that was the right thing to do, because this was fresh information about James Damore, whether it's right or wrong, irrespective, was out there, and we should see that. The thing we did wrong was that in presenting it, we presented it in a UX component called Top Stories, which is typically where we put news content, and which tends to give it a degree of endorsement. It's what we call a high promise UI. And so we used a high promise UI for very low grade content. But I think it's emblematic of, in a sense, our challenge. And part of what one gets to there, interestingly, is what is the role of a search engine? And this is something that we've been talking about lately, and talking about how do we actually engage with the outside world on this. And part of this, and part of the challenge here, is in a sense of our own making, in that we pride ourselves on giving people the answer. Right? And if you come to Google and ask for the temperature outside, we'll tell you exactly what it is. If you ask for James Comey's height, we'll tell you he's 6 feet 8 inches tall, and proudly so. And that's great. And so I think it has created this perception of many of our users that we're surfacing high quality vetted content all the time. And obviously that's not the case. And in fact, I think in my own thinking, a perfect search engine is one that not only gives you excellent, truthful results, but also provides the opportunity to understand the dark layers of our culture. Because without that, in a sense, we're our own. We create our own silo of understanding of our own societies. The question and the challenge becomes for us is to figure out how do we properly convey that to our users, right? How do we properly convey that yes, that 4chan information is there. We're not endorsing it one way or the other. We don't know. We don't get to fact check the web on a minute by minute basis. But it's important that stuff be found, but it's also important that it be found with sufficient context that people don't jump to conclusions and say, well, because it's in Google search results, it's a right and truthful answer.
So it wasn't James Damore, it was Gary Danley?
Oh, Gary Danley, yes.
James Damore, the guy who wrote the memo.
Yeah, thank you.
Please don't suggest he was a shooter.
Thank you, Krishna. I appreciate the real-time fact checking. That's really good. Ooh, gosh, you could come to all kinds of conclusions as to how I kind of cut to that mistake. But again, I think that last point about what's the role of a search engine in helping people understand that's on us. Right? I mean, that's something I think that we have to do a better job of guiding people on. So again, we'll look to continue to evolve what we do as smartly as we can. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes with some other thoughts. So, all right, so we got this raucous environment out there. Great expression, ugly expression, fake expression, so on and so forth. And this ultimate challenge of how democracies survive in that world of complete and total expression. So, to me, in the news space, and by the way, what I should have mentioned up front, just to kind of give you a sense of my role as Vice President of News, there's sort of two dimensions of it. One side is indeed, our strategies in terms of how we surface news on our experiences, whether it be Google Search or Google News, or other new products that we develop, the Google Assistant and so on and so forth. That's one part. But the other part of my job is, what can we do as Google to help enable a robust and sustainable ecosystem for news, which is obviously important to these very, very basic questions. And that has involved efforts like the AMP project, which is can we re-architect the web for speed, open source project, the Trust project, and a new project we announced about 4 weeks ago called the Subscriptions Project, which is how do we help publishers grow their subscription bases since the economics of news have changed. So let me shift a bit and talk about the economics of news. So one of the common criticisms of Google these days is the duopoly, is that Google and Facebook have taken all of the ad revenue. But I think here too, it's important to kind of understand really, how the economics of news have worked and how it's evolved over the years. I mean, obviously the current disruption, the real cause of the disruption of the publishing business is indeed the internet itself, right? Because it allowed, not just us to offer new ad products, it allowed Craig Newmark to do a wonderful thing for his community and create Craigslist, which in turn took away a whole segment of high margin revenue of the newspaper industry. That's what happens when the world of media distribution changes. So here, for instance, when I talk about the economics of news, I'm in this case specifically going to talk about the economics of, quotes, the newspaper of, say, 40 years ago versus today. Because I say this because sometimes we have, I think, overly romantic notions of certain kinds of media models, and newspapers is indeed one of them. And my father ran the press rooms at the Providence Journal, and my first job was as a flyboy in the press room at the Providence Journal. So I have an intimate knowledge of newspapers, right down to ink-stained fingers. But the truth is a newspaper business in the United States was not, for the most part of its comparatively short history, less than 200 years, was a dog-eat-dog business. It was a very, very competitive business. That changed, interestingly, in the early 50s. And it changed with the introduction of television. Television was introduced in 1947. By 1950, it was taking 17% of the total ad market in the United States in 3 years. That's a massive amount of market share. And its impact was entirely on newspapers. It didn't really affect magazines, didn't affect radio. It affected newspapers because television at that time was a local ad medium only. In fact, it was a local content medium only at that time. So it had a huge impact on newspapers. And what happened over the course of the 50s and early 60s was a lot of newspapers shut down, right? I mean, we went from cities that had a dozen newspapers or more to cities that had one, or in San Francisco here with two that were allowed to operate as one on the sales side based on a Justice Department ruling. And then what happened is, so you dramatically reduced the quantity of newspapers or newspaper voices in that time. But then it turned out for those last guys standing to be a remarkably effective business. That's when you saw, it was in the early 60s that you saw, the newspaper expand from a fairly thin newspaper that had maybe one section, maybe two, to one that had 8, 9, or 10, where you had the gardening section and the food section and the lifestyle section and the classified section and the automotive section, all created because the ad sales department said, we could sell a boatload of ads if you guys actually collected some content and audience for me to sell those ads against. So it was fabulous. It was great for the reader. It was a tremendously robust product, and it was superb for the bottom line, right? I mean, as Lord Thompson of Fleet said, owning a printing press is like having a license to print money. Yeah, it was definitely true for 30, 40 years in this country. So you had, a tremendously successful papers. But the underlying truth there is it was a largely advertising-driven business. It was something like, if you actually looked at the revenue breakout of a newspaper in, say, 1975, 1985, it'd be like 98% advertising revenue, 2% circulation revenue. They didn't really care about circulation revenue. In fact, the rule of thumb in the business was the circulation revenue covered the cost of the newsprint, right? Because they could do well on so well on advertising, which was a great and fabulous thing. And indeed, it was the food section and the style section that paid for the local news coverage, that paid for the international coverage. And in truth, if you actually studied readership surveys really carefully, then that's also where the usage went, right? I mean, if you think about it, if you subscribed to the Dallas Morning News or the Boston Globe in 1980, that was basically your local internet, right? It gave you everything you needed to be informed about your local community and how you could take and enjoy your life, whether it was the movie times or the stock quotes or recipes in the food section or reports out of the city council, which was an interesting dynamic. In fact, I'm going to divert here for a second because I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues several weeks ago about trust models. How do people form a sense of trust? And out of that conversation came the observation, which I think is a pretty interesting one, that if you look back at that newspaper back in 1985, the internet of your community, for you, and that largely its value proposition was actually the provision of all these mundane facts. Again, movie times, weather reports, stock quotes, recipes. And they got them right. The newspaper got it right. They got the sports scores right every day. They got the movie times right every day. And so if they got that right, then probably the news coverage was trustworthy as well, right? And also back at that time, interestingly, so if you looked at the total composition of a newspaper in 1985, it'd probably be about 80% what I would call lifestyle content, soft content, all the things that made all the money, about 20% news content. And of that 20% news content, there was the singular editorial page and later the op-ed page. So it was probably 18.5% news coverage, 1.5% opinion, right? Now you fast forward to today, and what's the makeup of, say, the Washington Post? Well, you don't go to it for the mundane facts anymore because you get those from everywhere else, right? What you get from them is news coverage and opinion. And interestingly, there too, now the split is different. I would say, I mentioned this to Marty Barron, and he didn't disagree. It might be off by percentage points in one direction or another, is that the Washington Post today is about 40% news coverage and about 60% opinion, perspective, analysis, right? And then so you begin to think, well, all right, to the extent people are forming a sense of distrust about a news vehicle, to what extent is the overabundance of low-cost opinion content affecting their perception of the news coverage? I would say there is a factor there. And I don't say that to blame any news publication. Again, we're talking about the dynamics of media constructs and how people take and interpret them. So the economics of a newspaper in the heyday of news was a cross-subsidy model where indeed the gardening content paid for the local news coverage. And that's largely disappeared, right? There's almost no cross-subsidy anymore. Because again, that content, when I ran Salon, and I was looking to kind of turn Salon around, this was 10 or so years ago, I looked at the horribly low CPMs we would get for advertising against news content, right? Interestingly, back in the newspaper day, Tiffany's, I think they still do this today, Tiffany's advertised in the front section of the New York Times every day. In the front section, right? Up against articles about people starving in Darfur would be a Tiffany's ad for a diamond bracelet. They would never do that online. They don't do that online, right? They buy ads for demographics and relevance, and it's not going to be against news content at all. So as a result, the CPMs on ads against the news content were, down in the low single digits. And so I went and
Sorry, what is the acronym?
cost per thousand
Okay.
eyeballs, as it were. So there were the CPMs for news ads were down $2-3, whereas for lifestyle content significantly higher. And so I said, all right, fine, let's expand. I went for my own cross-subsidy model. Let's add a food section. Let's add more sections, and we did, and it was good, high-quality stuff. But what I found, in working with my ad sales department was that we were competing against sites that were doing, just gardening content. Just food content, and had a far crisper commercial proposition for advertisers than we had at Salon, right? So again, the whole cross-subsidization model is largely gone out the window, and it's hard. So now, a publisher like the New York Times, and I hate to use them as an example because they're large, national, and they will, I think, ultimately do just fine. They're already doing, I think, quite well. But your typical local news brand now is having to, they can't quite make it on ads at all. So what circulation revenue that used to pay for their newsprint now needs to pay for their business, which is why, obviously, we announced the subscription project and are moving to see, are there things that we can do to help drive subscription revenue? I do hope, by the way, that one other thing comes out of that is in a sense, a shift in thinking about how they look at their readers. Because one thing, as I point out when we announced that, I said, like, we can provide some good technology and tools, but none of this changes marketplace economics. People will subscribe for what they perceive has value. And I do think one of the challenges in the legacy newspaper business is that many of these products have not really rethought themselves for what the value proposition needs to be today. All right. Many of them are offering largely the same products they offered 30 or 40 years ago, but just digitally. And honestly, it's not going to cut it because the value proposition isn't there. There are good examples out there, but I do think that, I do think the shift to subscriptions, one of the things I think might be positive about it is to focus more on the value proposition and less on the clicks. How do we provide value and not just engaging content? But we'll see. From that, I think beyond that, which sort of gets to that, is I think at the same time we need to reinvent journalism. This is, I think, is abundantly clear. It's been clear for a long time, but I think it's now, hitting people in more pronounced ways given the environment that we're in, right? Because the truth is that, these news organizations are competing on equal footing with all kinds of sites out there. Of good quality, of poor quality, that are solely disinformation. So given the challenges we face with our democracies, is how do we rethink what journalism institutions are? And I think these are big and open questions. I think we see good progress in some fronts, and it involves everything from how does one evolve storytelling for the world that we're in, because not only is the world different, people consume information in many different ways than they did 40 years ago, right? We're on our phones all the time, snacking at content all the time. We're rushed, we don't have time. So how does one break through and provide valuable content that has impact and that gains the credibility and trust of users? So I think that services a whole host of questions of, as I said, how does one evolve models of storytelling? Might one create new kinds of content artifacts? One of the things that Google, that we worked on with the journalism community over the last 4 years or so, was the whole notion of these standalone fact checks. Many of them coming from independent fact-checking organizations like PolitiFact and many others, but also coming from existing news organizations like the Washington Post. Because we thought that was very useful to be able to surface fact checks against questionable content, against content where we knew there were claims that were not likely to be true. And so we've looked to stimulate the fact check community, which is now close to 400 organizations around the world, to generate fact checks that can be surfaced in various ways, including in Google search. What I would like to see, within a few years as that corpus grows, is the surfacing of those fact checks in many areas of content, not just news and politics. How many people come to Dr. Google every day looking to medical information? And I can tell you that just as in all things on the internet, there's a lot of bad medical information out there. If you do a search for peach pits cause cancer, you'll find many sites that tell you that indeed, not cause, cure cancer. Many sites out there will tell you, with great and thoughtful rationale how indeed it does. So how can we actually then insert fact checks from, say, the Mayo Clinic or these fact check organizations to give users an opportunity to grab a different perspective? Again, there are no silver bullets here, which is why we take the approaches we take of how do we take and look at every dimension of the news business, of every dimension of journalism, of every dimension of what we do with our products to see how we can effectively move the ball forward. Data journalism, I think there's just tremendous potential in data journalism that we haven't quite realized as yet. And I think this is particularly important in our world, because one of the challenges that I have when I look at our media space is several issues, and I'll collapse them into an example. What was it, 3, 4, 5 months ago? I am going to trip on that at some point, but that's okay. There was that attack on the British Parliament in London. 4 people died. Our cable news networks here went wall to wall for 3 days. Wall to wall coverage of the British Parliament attack for 3 days. It was wonderful. You go on and they're just kind of repeating the same video over and over and over again, talking about it over and over again. To me, that speaks to a couple of issues. One is giving disproportionate attention to an event. And again, there's no way to adjudicate this or set rules for this, but it is indeed a problem. You know, because interestingly, they went 3 days wall to wall. On those same 3 days in the United States, on each of those days, there were mass murders of 4 or more people that didn't make it into the news. And in almost any of that coverage about the Parliament attack, was there any numerical context that gave you a sense of, you know, is it an important issue? Yes, but how important? You know, how important to me and my community, right? Like, so one of the things is that as I've been working with folks in the data journalism community is, how do we make it easier to bring you know, statistics into the context as well? Not that statistics are all truth, as we know, lies, damn lies, and statistics, but you know, news coverage typically focuses on the anomalous and does so anecdotally. Without necessarily establishing the context. So, you know, you cover a home invasion, but often what doesn't get into the article is, you know, well, actually, has this happened 3 times a month in the last 3 years, or has it happened once in the last 3 years? Important to know if you live in that community, you know. So one of the things I think about, and I'll just close it on this point, is you know, as metaphorically as like the, you know, the data that we as citizens tend to see every day, you know, is like the weather report. It tells us the comfort of our community, at least meteorologically. Do I need a raincoat? And one of the things that I would like to see is, how do we give citizens the key metrics about their communities to help them understand more about their community beyond the weather? You know, could I have a weather report for where I live in Los Altos or Berkeley or Oakland or wherever that gives me a sense of, well, what are the crime statistics? You know, how is the cost of housing going? What's the air quality index? What's the high school graduation rate? And is that in or out of norm compared to other communities? In other words, can we give citizens the tools and information they need to be good citizens? Right? I mean, that my own preferred definition of journalism is just that, is how do we give citizens the tools and information they need to be good citizens? And I think there are lots more we can do with the capabilities that we have today with data. I had dinner a while back with a former head of the FCC who told me that, and he said this 2 years ago, so if I advance it forward, that within the next year or so, there would be 50 billion sensing devices connected to the internet collecting data, right? So we live in a data-rich world, and so, you know, my challenge there for the journalism community is, how can the journalism community take and work off that data to really give us a better sense of the world around us and what should be important to us when we go into that election booth. So again, I mean, you know, when we think about the world of news, how do we rethink the business models? How do we rethink form and function and what kind of services that can be provided? And then last but not least, how do we regain trust? And by the way, trust in news media did not start breaking down with the internet. And actually in the United States, it started breaking down roughly in the early 1970s, if you believe the polling. The internet certainly hasn't helped, but it didn't cause it. And that was the purpose, that is the purpose of the Trust Project that was mentioned in the intro. And so let me touch on that. And in fact, later this week, there'll be, the Trust Project will be making their announcement of their first phase recommendations to the industry. But the whole notion of the Trust Project was, given the fact that we all live in this maelstrom of expression called the internet and the World Wide Web, you know, far more expression, far more voices than we've ever seen before, from a world that I grew up in where I knew all the major news sites and I knew I read the magazines my parents read, to one where everything is there, where indeed the New York Times is competing on equal footing with a blogger, is is how do we take and rethink the architecture of news and how it presents itself to users in the interest of, again, making sure they understand the credibility of the underlying work. The Trust Project, by the way, it's not about a badge. It's not about saying, oh, you're a trusted site and you're not a trusted site. I don't buy that personally, because I don't believe that any single organization or even any 10 organizations can or should tell you what's a good, and I mean, they can, it's just not terribly meaningful to me. The effort with the Trust Project is how do we, again, rethink the architecture of news, such that news organizations can present, in a sense, more granular signals, as we think of at Google, to help us understand the content and to help the reader understand the content as well. One of the things they found in their research was, not surprisingly in the media world today, people's development of a sense of trust and affinity isn't about the brand, it's about the individual behind the article. And that's an important thing to know. But given that, then might that suggest value in being more transparent, at the byline, who's behind the article, what's their background, what's their full body of work. What can help me develop a sense that they know what they know and I should actually trust the conclusions they've reached. Can news organizations on particularly important or serious articles take advantage of structures that we've had in academic publishing and provide more footnotes that support the nature of the conclusions they've reached. So all of these various, can they provide, one of the things that I've pushed for them to recommend, which will be in there indeed, is to ask news organizations to tag their articles by type. And here too, no perfect solutions, it's a noisy space, but what's a piece of news coverage versus an opinion piece versus, say, an explainer or an interview? That would be useful, I think, for the reader to know, and it'd be useful for the algorithms of services like Google to know as well. In fact, 6 months or so ago, the Washington Post completely revamped their labeling of articles on their site. Because they had all of these, as I said, 60% opinion, 40% news coverage. You had, columns like The Fix and 202, and how do you know what this stuff is? I mean, if you actually talk to them, they say, like in a perspective piece that was ragged right, we indicated that because it was ragged right. And again, ragged right, like who in the world knows this stuff? No one knows this stuff. And so the Post reduced it to 6 labels. They can still have The Fix, but it will say opinion next to it. To help inform the user. There's a lot said about the need for media literacy, and no one can question that. There's obviously a great need for media literacy, but one of my reactions to that is say, well, wait a second. Yeah, there should be media literacy training, but do I need training in a user manual to understand what's what from a news site, right? When I was at Apple, it was at a time when we stopped including user manuals with the computers, because part of it was, we could reduce the cost of goods, but the other part of it was the designers shouldn't be able to lean on a user manual. The product should be self-explanatory. Well, I think we can do far better in the media space in that regard, and I think we do far better at Google as well. I think that's part of our challenge as well, is how do we help guide our users with better indications about what they're seeing in the morass of expression that's out there. Not easy challenges, but again, I think it's part of what we need to take on in addressing the big issues we see today. So I said I was going to ramble for a short bit, and I obviously didn't ramble for a short bit, but I'm going to stop right here and right now. And let's take questions.
So first, thank you so much for your insight. I worked in tech for 5 years and then decided to come to Stanford to the journalism school. And probably the biggest surprise coming into a more humanities-driven program was the first day of class, every single class we talked about ethics. And there's this kind of implicit Hippocratic oath in newsrooms that's pervasive across the country. And in most media organizations. Yet if you ask Facebook and Google, a lot of executives will be the first to say that they're not a media organization, they're a technology company. If Google isn't a media organization, how do you inspire your team to think about serving the public interest as opposed to just the bottom line? And how can we get technologists to be thinking about the psychic value of certain public interest?
I mean, again, different companies will deal with this in different ways. I think Apple. All right, the question, if I can briefly, probably not giving due justice, but media organizations, some media organizations, not all, but most media organizations have ethics policies. And there is a strong ethos to, you talk to journalists, there's a strong belief in what they do. And the question was, should that, in effect, not be true of tech companies as well? I actually do think that is the case at Google. And I think it's been the case at Google since very early on. The don't do evil was a very serious thing, and is a serious thing at Google. And we continue to have discussions about what our internal values are. Inside Google, there's its own separation of church and state. If you're working on Google Search or Google News, you're not thinking about ads and revenue at all, right? You're thinking about how you serve the user. Now, to your point, I think going forward, we have to be actually even ever more clear about what drives us as a culture, as an organization, and also what's the philosophy behind our products. What's the philosophy and principles behind the algorithms of Google Search? I think that's a very, very fair question to ask of us, and we recognize that, and I think we'll be continuing to rethink how we talk about it going forward. Because, look, we can't deny, we play a very significant role in the ecosystem. Very powerful role in the ecosystem. Some might say it's too powerful, right? But given that we play that role, then yeah, we have to step up and be responsible for the things we do. We have to step up and not only hear the criticism that people have, but address it and respond to it. Very fair. Yes.
Okay, so dovetailing on that previous question about the sort of journalism ethics, you sort of gave a historical perspective on the sort of the historical market economics of journalism and how it's changed. Where did these journalism ethics sort of come from historically? Was it an emergent market force? Because that seems sort of implausible, because we have this insatiable appetite for like tabloid stuff.
Yeah.
And so where did it kind of come from, and where is it going, and does it still, how has it changed over time?
It's a good question, and I don't consider myself by any means I'm not a media historian in the classic sense, but and maybe others here can feel free to chime in on this point. First of all, when we say the world of journalism, we have to recognize that it means many and varied things, right? There are news organizations and publications which approach it from very many different dimensions. And if you go around the world, you see even more dramatic differences than you see here in terms of truly partisan papers. What's the history of the notion of ethics in journalism? I think my sense is it's a comparatively modern thing, and probably something that doesn't go back much more than 60 or 70 years. I'm a strong fan of it. I'm a strong fan of the notion of fact-based journalism, but that doesn't mean necessarily that everyone signs up to that. I think that part of what I mean is like when I say we need to rethink who we are as journalists, or publications need to rethink themselves. It's not just about ethics, but it's like one of the questions I asked to Marty Barron was, if your objective as the editor is to give people fact-based knowledge, for them to be good citizens, then why do you even bother to have an editorial page if that editorial page is likely to skew the perception of the news coverage itself? And his answer was, the editorial page doesn't report to me. And I don't say that. I don't say that as a criticism of Marty, who's a brilliant, well-meaning, passionate fellow. And indeed, the editorial page doesn't report him, so it was also a fairly truthful, not a fairly, it was a truthful answer. Yes?
Two quick comments. I think the idea of unbiased and fair news originated with press associations of the Civil War. So they could sell the same article to many different papers who had different viewpoints. That's what I've heard. As far as bylines, I think it's interesting. The Economist, which I think is a very trusting organization, has no bylines at all. And in fact, if you ask, they won't tell you. You've talked a lot about what news organizations and what Google should do. I wonder about improving the audience. Should children grow up out of school with some sense or better sense of media savvy? Can Google assist that?
Oh, without question. I think, again, that's part of, I think we all agree it should be taught in schools. Of course, the problem extends beyond the young, which is why I said what I said. And even then, I wouldn't sit back and rely on it. That's why I say, to some extent, again, these are hard nuts to crack because, even looking at the notion of news coverage versus opinion can be very hazy at times. But, to me, media literacy can kind of be broken down to two things: is how do you understand, is can you ferret out the expertise beyond the article and the motivation behind the article? And if you can do that, you'll come a long way. And that's why I think that we can, not only in terms of say are there things that we're doing to help media literacy training? Yes, but I would rather see us also take it upon ourselves to say, well, how do we do our job and how we present content? And we are doing some of this today, but I think we can do more of it and better. I grimace when I say go to Google News and the top story in the cluster, the top article in a story cluster, say about Sessions' testimony today. This wasn't the case with Sessions' testimony, but when I look at a cluster about a story in the first article, I open it up and it's opinion piece. You're like, I would have liked to known that before I clicked, because I probably wouldn't. And I wouldn't even lead the cluster with an opinion piece if I knew it was an opinion piece.
You've talked a little about what are straight up facts that the algorithms at Google could help us organize. And I'm building a periodic table of quality of life elements using public finance and other data. Could use your help. Getting even the basics of a straight story of budgets across the cities and counties and states is a nightmare. If you've got the algorithmic power in Google to sort the identity of people, you probably have the algorithmic power to sort the identity of how dollars are transacted.
There are certainly things we can do, and certainly things we are doing. One of the teams that's in my organization is the Google Trends team, and one of the things that they've been looking at is some things that we can do with the data journalism community in terms of helping with unstructured data, and how do we take and build stronger sets of structured data that more and more people can build off of. I think that's an important thing. Now, of course, one of the problems in that space, as in many of these, is like crime statistics in the United States are really hard to get. They vary community by community, and they vary depending on who's running Washington. We're seeing a lot of crime statistics actually being pulled back rather than brought forward. But nonetheless, how can we take the data that's there?
You also have Google Earth and Google Maps.
Precisely.
Contextualize
Yeah.
it.
So there are certainly things we can do. Part of the things with the fact check community, well, someone said, well, not all the fact checks are necessarily true. But I say, yeah, but as that corpus grows, we can at least begin to look for consensus, right? In a lot of things, there's no absolute truth. You can at best come up with a consensus. Yes.
Quick question. My name is Thomas Johns. I'm a failed electrical engineer and geopolitical consultant. But I've been thinking, I've been listening and everything, and essentially all across the world right now we have a bunch of values competing in this sort of zero-sum games, just trying to compete on, what's the best way to live. And each of these value systems have their own form of democracies. And as you say, how is democracy changing for us as technology changes. And we're looking to essentially a more integrative sort of democracy. But each of these value systems also have different values for trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are your thoughts on value systems that will never trust you, no matter what you do?
Yeah, I certainly don't have any magical solution for it. I do recognize the issue. I mean, as a result of the work I do, I spend an awful lot of time, around the world, talking to publishers, the press, public policy people. And not surprisingly, in the last year, a lot of those conversations, particularly with, say, government ministers and so on, is around the area of fake news. And suffice to say, when you have that discussion in Singapore or Indonesia, it's not the same conversation that you have with someone in France or Germany, because they don't have a First Amendment, they don't truly have a free press, so that they look at these things in different ways. That, of course, that's in a sense one of our challenges as a global company, is how do we take and do what we would like to do in ways that don't get terribly subverted by local governments. And in some cases, as was the case with China, we said we can't do this and pulled out entirely. But it's a scary world in that regard, because we're seeing, I'm seeing too many countries where things are going in the wrong direction. And by the way, when it comes to the free expression, I don't want to suggest. There are very interesting issues that we're going to have to deal with in the whole balance of free expression versus privacy. For instance, if you look at augmented reality, we already see today that obviously someone can come out and dox you and slander you in the world of the internet, rightfully or not. How does that work if they put a label on the top of your house via augmented reality, calling you a creep or something worse? Where are the boundaries of free expression versus privacy? In the prior world, some of your privacy came just out of obfuscation. I can say the word, honest, I can if I practice it 3 times. But that changes in the world of the internet, where everything can be available at your fingertips. So, yes, there, then there.
Me?
Yes.
What is the process that you have internally for deciding when to suppress information?
When to suppress information? Well, first of all, it depends on the context, and it largely depends on legality. So, when you say suppress, I mean, Google search, we don't suppress anything. We rank things, and obviously, something might be on page 10 versus on page 1 of results. But it's largely driven by issues of legality. Otherwise, we're talking about challenges of ranking. Now, there too, around the world, there are different, like I said, hate speech. And I recently spent a bunch of time in 5 different European capitals, all of which had very different views on hate speech. Or France with the right to be forgotten. I mean, that was an interesting challenge for us as well. So it's obviously very, very case by case in terms of how we deal with these things.
But is there a group of people that are making these decisions? Are there different groups?
There's a collection of groups. I mean, I'll say this. In my average week, I probably spend 2 or 3 hours with lawyers. Right? I mean, we've got, every product at Google has a product council. So when these kinds of issues come up, you have legal people who get involved. You have public policy people who get involved. Do we need changes in our own policies? How do we respond to the certain demands of government? How can we be as transparent about that as possible? But it's a constant. Yes, sir. And then I'll move over to that.
Given the level of divisiveness that currently exists and the strength of the belief that people, for convenience, let's say, on either side of an issue may have, and the access they have to hundreds of publications and the readers who have similar beliefs, what mechanism can you conceive of? What process that will find, I mean, barring some cataclysmic event, that will provide an opportunity for some kind of conciliatory activity?
Yeah, that is, in a sense, the question of the day, isn't it? You know, obviously, it would be helpful to not have people in political power who are denigrating the institutions that we're trying to build up. But then again, I think it's also, you know, it's also on the world of media in terms of how, again, do we rethink those models to, you know, one of the things is the only way you can begin to bridge consensus is like, how do you develop you know, I don't really see much hope in bringing the people at the extremes together. The question is there a fat enough middle? And when it comes to fact-based knowledge, is can we build an ever larger repository of commonly understood, you know, facts? You know, these are, I'm optimistic about things, but we're talking about a lot of things that I think need to evolve to get there. Now, I can also imagine, again, if you've got changes in political attitude, if you even have a few, you know, one of the reasons why I spend a lot of time with publishers and trying to drive innovation is like you're looking is, can you drive, you know, can you drive new models of success that others will follow, right? Because again, it's a broad industry, you know, we see some of that, but not enough. Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much. And I agree with you that we need to rethink what journalism looks like and reinvent it. And you said you have some examples of progress, and I'd be curious what you think those are. But also, once we do that, what does the business model look like? Because subscriptions and, as you said, circulation in the past historically has been such a small part of revenue for news outlets. So I'm not sure that subscriptions is a 100% viable business model for news going forward. So what does that look like to you?
Well, again, I think I'll give you a couple of examples on a couple of business model dimensions. One is there's an organization in Paris called Mediapart. It was founded by Edwy Plenel, who is a former editor of Le Monde. Founded it in 2006, so it's almost 10 years old, more than 10 years old. He's got a very focused mission. You know, there's no fluff. It's largely about serious news investigations. He's very, very clear about the mission. He's been also very clear from the beginning about his business model, which was subscriptions, is subscriptions. He's got 150,000 paying subscribers at €10 a month. And he's got roughly 45, 50 journalists, and he's profitable, right? So I do think it takes that, you know, again, very much a reconsideration of the product, a reconsideration of how it presents itself to the audience that you hope it will find. There's a very creative woman in the field today, a young woman by the name of Jennifer Brendel, a small company called Harken. And she's working with news organizations on the whole notion of how do you help a news organization to establish greater connections and bonds with its community? You know, so I mean, her core thesis is should an effective news organization in a community not be more democratic in the sense of reaching out to the community, assessing their needs? What are the real issues of the community? You know, I think it's appropriate for a news organization to advocate on issues, not necessarily by providing the answer, but by saying, yeah, we know that the state of the city schools is a problem, and we're going to put a particular focus on that for the next year. Understanding the problem, understanding possible solutions, right? There are some folks led by a guy out of Denmark that's broadening, that's on the whole notion of constructive journalism, right? How do we take and do journalism in ways that again, are meaningful beyond being, you know, just salacious, to be extreme in that point. Back on the very local side, there's an interesting digital chain in Canada called Village Media. founded by a guy named Jeff Elgie. And he now has, and it's pure digital, he founded it some 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. He now has community news sites in 7 cities, and he's profitable. And he doesn't do subscriptions at all. It's all advertising in his case. Interestingly, part of his model is when he selects the communities, is he looks for communities in a range of 75 to 150,000 people that have a strong sense of community identity. A way to think about that last part is that he won't do a bedroom community of Toronto because it doesn't have its own self-identity. And he goes into those markets. The editorial teams are small, half a dozen or so people. He uses ad platforms like ours, but he also sells his own local advertising. And he's he's found a successful model. But he went in it, part of this, one of the big challenges for legacy papers is the almost impossible transition from the old model to the new. Because they're trying to hold on, and understandably, to every dollar they make over the old model as long as it lives, but also its underlying cost structure. But that, in the same token, impedes its efforts to really rethink its future. Because they're not looking at the future with a clean slate saying, if we came to this community, just starting today, what would we build? No, they're starting it from the perspective of, this is the way we used to do it. Maybe that's the way we should do it, so let's compromise somewhere in the middle. That's almost an impossible row to hoe. So I do think it doesn't take much to convince me that there's success to be found in the news business. But it does require an extreme focus on what you're doing and who are you doing it for and how do you convince them of that. I was participating in a seminar, and somebody said they were going to do a session on brand, how to rebrand yourself. And I said, rebrand yourself, that's kind of step 2. Isn't step 1 figuring out what exactly are you? What kind of product are you? What benefits do you provide? And then once you understand that, then you can start to think about the branding. Yes.
I'm an IT fellow here at Stanford from Norway. And from our view, seems to be a really growing interest in the term the careful 5, as I'm sure you're aware of, naming you guys with Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple, and that it's just become too powerful. And there's a lot of concern about the government has to regulate if you can't self-regulate. And also in terms of U.S. history, what's happened before, that we're kind of a tipping point. I really like your views on that. If you can take your citizen hat on maybe also and look at that question. Do you agree with this, that you become too powerful and there's a question of democratic challenge?
No, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think when one brings up those questions, they're impossible. It's almost impossible to have that discussion at a macro level. Even start with the notion of the platforms. People say, oh, the platforms, or the 5, or whatever. But let's say the platforms, Google, Facebook, Apple. Say, well, first of all, recognize these are very, very different beasts, right? Apple is a proprietary hardware platform with a proprietary operating system. Facebook is a proprietary social network that largely operates as a walled garden. I don't say this as criticism; it's just what they are, right? YouTube, you could say, is a platform for expression that's sort of probably more like Facebook than it is like Apple or Google. But if you look at Google and Google search, we're a child of the web. We're a child of the open environment of the web, and that's largely what drives us. What I've often said over the last several years with publishers is, look, our objective with regard to the open web is the same as a publisher has. You want a vibrant open web today if you're a publisher. And we require a vibrant open web, because without a vibrant open web, Google search wouldn't have its value. And obviously our ad platforms wouldn't be successful. So I do think you got to, first of all, look at what, when you say that, well, what are the issues you're trying to address and how do you address them? Where is size a problem and where is it not a problem? If you said, and I've had people say, oh, we should break up Google search. There should be more than one search engine. And I go, well, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Think about that for a second. Do you want 5 search engines where they might evolve to be actually partisan search engines? I don't know. But my point is one of my big points is given the complexity of the space, given the issues, as I said, of cultural lag, do we fully understand the impacts? Be careful about asking your governments to come in and solve problems. You know, particularly in this world. That's what I say. It's like, be careful about that. Fair questions to ask, questions that require really thoughtful analysis, and then say, okay, what needs to be done? And is it regulation of, quotes, the platforms? Is it regulations on matters that relate to the platforms? I mean, you could easily look at this country and say, you know, actually the laws on political fundraising and the use of political funds are really not very tight. Might you want to address that? I could get on board with that. That would certainly make our lives a little bit easier. You know, so it's a tricky thing. I mean, the right to be forgotten, to me, was a particularly bizarre case. You know, not that the right to be forgotten in and of itself is a bad thing. You know, you can look around the world and, you know, like here, if I committed a crime as a juvenile, at some point as an adult, I actually can go, I can actually file a civil procedure to get my record eradicated. That's fair and reasonable. Right to be forgotten, what did right to be forgotten do? Actually, it doesn't create any administrative, any governmental process to address it. They just said, oh, right to be forgotten means that you can actually appeal to a search engine to get them eliminated for the index of search. And so we end up, because the politicians didn't really want to take, don't quote me on this. They didn't really solve the problem in any kind of holistic way in their environment. They said, oh, we'll have the platforms do it. So, you know, that's not I can't give you a complete answer because it's obviously a very complex set of questions. I just think we need to be, you know, careful and thoughtful as we go down that road. You know, when people talk about we've done very, very good in advertising, right? We managed to latch on particularly effective ad products like search ads. Tremendous business. We also have ad platforms that are used by 2 million publishers around the world, where we share 70+% of the revenue with the publishers. So, you know, when you look at it, say, well, all right, what are the problems that exist here and don't exist here, and how do you address them? You know, I can look at the markets for advertising, for instance, and say, you know, we've actually opened up opportunities for merchants and businesses to buy advertising at a far more effective, cost-effective way than they ever could before. Right? They come to our systems and they do it. And obviously at the same time, people look at that, oh yes, people can come and do micro-targeting, but also bad people can come and take advantage of that, as we've also seen. With all of these things, there are some significant benefits, there are potential problems. And clearly, you want to address the problems, but not necessarily kill what's good about the new model. One more. I mean, I have to. Richard has to ask a question.
Of course. So we'll do one last question, and then unfortunately we're
So I want to go back to trust and how we might build it. One solution that I've always been very intrigued by is Wikipedia's solution of transparency, of having an edit tab where they strive for objectivity, but they also recognize there is no such thing, and so they reveal the history of how a story gets to be told and how it's changed over time. Do you have any sense that there are some techniques like that could be used to build trust by being more transparent?
No, I think there are, and I don't think we've seen huge amounts of development there. Jimmy Wales is looking at that with Wiki Tribune, not surprisingly. There are certainly people in the pioneering edges of the news space who are taking that on in more significant ways. It's not. I don't see it happening inside the legacy institutions. I think a lot of the innovation is going to come out of the more entrepreneurial efforts, which are stepping back and again rethinking it from scratch, including how do we develop trust from scratch. And there are a lot of people, I think, who buy into the notion that transparency matters, that you can do journalism transparently in effective ways. By the way, I mean, they're also here, as challenged as the environment is, I think it is kind of stunning the amount of investigative journalism that is being done today. And I would actually love to see the analysis. My own sense is actually there's more being done today than there was 30, 40 years ago. It is being done in new and different ways, and it's typically done by small organizations. But in a sense, that was often the case in the past as well. I've been spending a bunch of time recently with Gerard Ryle and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the guys who did the Panama Papers and now the Paradise Papers. That's a fascinating approach to collaborative journalism, which is not only cost efficient, but generating a tremendous amount of good reporting off of a common base of data. I think that's just one example of the kinds of things I think that can be done and done differently and done well. So, as I said, I'm generally extremely optimistic about the future of news because of these kinds of things. But it takes time to get there. If there's one disappointment in my own history with this is like we are 25 years into the web, and I think so much of the publishing community took 2 decades to get a real sense of what was going on. And I think it's probably natural cycles of disruption, but painful nonetheless, that we've gotten this far and not innovated as much as I would like to think we could. Anyways, I thank you for the time. Sorry to go long.